Hey, Dan here, and this is my final project for the history course that we're doing, History 512, the American Revolution. I must say I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've definitely learned a lot and kind of refreshed my memory on things that I've studied in the past. What I wanted to do for my project is to concentrate or give a little talk, actually a little video here, about the transportation systems that were in place during the American Revolution and how those may have impacted the war effort, either positive or negative. And it affected both sides, not only the British, but also the colonial patriots that were fighting, for the freedom of our country or the establishment of our country. And to kind of give you an idea, an example that I have to give you, kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that are needed and the amounts of things that are needed for the troops to not only sustain themselves health-wise and food-wise, but along with that would go, the arms that they would need, the muskets, the wagons, you name it, anything that you would need for an army to live on, to be able to fight, that would all kind of come under a lot of this. But one example in particular, and is food, and kind of the food that would be needed by the soldiers when they're fighting. And as an example, early on in the war, this is specifically in July of 1775, when George Washington soon took, or had just taken command of the forces, he had about 17,000 soldiers under his command. By mid-October, that number had climbed to 22,000 approximately. And take that number and keep in mind, let me give you some numbers as far as just some of the foodstuffs that the soldiers are supposed to be given on a weekly basis. It didn't always happen this way, and as you can imagine, there's a variety of reasons for that. As an example, as of early June, just prior to when George Washington took command, the Massachusetts soldiers, we're talking about this group in this particular example, they were allotted a daily ration of 1 pound of bread, and the bread was to be accompanied by 1 pound and a quarter of beef or pork. They would get beef if they didn't have pork available. Once a week, the soldiers were to receive 1 1/4 pounds of saltfish in place of the day's meat allowance. And then the rations would also include a pint of milk, or about 4 ounces of rice, a quart of beer, about 4 ounces of peas or beans per day, and per week they were supposed to get about 6 ounces of butter, and then a pound of soap would be split between 6 men, and if available, half a pint of vinegar. Okay, so take those numbers and start multiplying them by just the 22,000 by mid-October, and it begins to give you an idea of the daunting task that these commanders, George Washington at the top and then all of his commanders below him, the task that they had to try and get their troops supplied. And as you can imagine, both sides had problems with this. When the hostilities broke out, the British soldiers and their men were ill prepared in that they did not have a lot of foodstuffs and supplies stockpiled. As you can imagine, the British soldiers and even the colonists prior to this point, all of their goods, or at least a lot of them, were shipped by a sailing ship from Europe, in particular, Great Britain, and they would be brought over that way. As an example, too, these sailing ships, they're relatively small. I have some pictures that will give you some examples of what they look like. And at best, some of these smaller ships could only carry maybe a few hundred tons of food. The largest sailing ships, maybe not of that time, but a little bit after, they're limited to like 14,000 tons. Just to give you a modern example of how much that is, a big truck, 18-wheeler going down the highway, can carry 40 tons in the trailers. So that gives you an idea of kind of the capability that they had at that time based on the equipment that they had. Many times today, we don't really give it a second thought as to where our food comes from in a big sense, or how it got to the store. We just go to the store, it's there. And that's great. That's the way, I mean, that's fine. That's the way it should be. But there's a lot of logistical work that goes on in the background to make all of that happen, much the same way as the soldiers on both sides found out about in the American Revolution. The logistical aspect of all of this, they didn't just think about it later and go, oh shoot, we got to put something together. They thought about this almost immediately. And both sides were raiding each other's foodstuffs, stores, ships. They would, not only the British, but the colonist side, they would intercept these ships and steal stuff from them. One of the big examples early on in the war was at Falmouth, Massachusetts, which is actually nowadays Portland, Maine. Because of this tit for tat going back and forth stealing stuff, the British ended up basically burning that town and destroying it for the most part because of supplies that were stolen from the British, by the colonists. Examples of the ships that I have here in the video presentation are from the Jamestown colony. These are replica ships that were built. So these are just to represent the types of ships that were sailing around not only the coastal waters of the colonies, but also would be going back and forth between England and the colonies taking supplies. And as you can see, they're fairly small. At best, these might only be able to take a few hundred tons of supplies. So the trips had to be carefully planned, and you had to really plan out what you're going to take, how many ships you're going to need based on weather conditions, times of the year, how far you had to travel, and so forth. So the shipping was one of the main forms of transportation very early on. It is very important to them, not only the British, but also to the colonists as well. Eventually, though, a lot of the British supplies would dry up for the colonists, and they would be replaced by other countries that would become friends, if you will, or allies of the new colonies. Within the colonies, you had a lot of rivers. And as you noted in one of my slides previous, it's no coincidence that a lot of the settlements were built around bodies of water, whether it's on the coast or along the rivers. And rivers especially were very important, and they were used to transport goods from the interior, especially down toward the coastal areas, whether it be for export or for sale or use by the colonists in those areas. And One of the big things that George Washington was concerned with early in his career prior to his political career, as you noted on one of my slides, was that he was interested in locks, like a dam and a lock, which would help move ships, or in this case, they would be boats, up and down the river to transport goods. And as you'll notice later on in my slides, I have a variety of boats that are pictured. In particular, I start off with the bateau, which is it's kind of interesting. We live here in the Lynchburg area along the James River, and that was a very important waterway in the colonial times, and it still is. But the bateau was the main boat for transporting goods up and down the river. As you can see, it's a flat bottom boat. It cannot carry a whole lot. And again, depending on the times of the year, some boats would be floated downriver and then they would not be able to go back upriver, so the boats would be sold off and scrapped and the wood used in other forms or means. I also have some Durham boats, which when you look at the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware and a variety of other resources, it looks like he was using a Durham boat. He could very well have been. They also had like barges and ferries that he could have used. But again, the Durham boat, it cannot carry a lot as far as weight. Both the bateau and the Durham boat, they might be in the vicinity of 60 to 80 feet long. About 8 to 10 feet wide. They're very shallow, so they can't carry a tremendous amount of weight. But they're very important for moving supplies and people up and down the inland waterways. Now, another means of transportation was the road system. And believe it or not, they did have a road system in place. Granted, you had basically trails from town to town, or say from an outlying community or farm to a larger town. They might just be like a trail or just a road big enough for a wagon to get through. But they did in their day kind of have a super highway. It was the King's Highway, and it basically went from Charlestown in the south, down in South Carolina, following the coast all the way up to Boston, Massachusetts. And that highway would be used to transport goods back and forth, travel back and forth. Initially, it was basically just a trail, but over the years, it took quite a few years to get this fully built. And once it was built, it was a pretty decent road to travel. And it would go through quite a few different areas that we know of today, like Wilmington, North Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, Williamsburg, naturally, that being the capital of Virginia at the time. And a lot of prominent cities right up the East Coast until you get to Boston. But travel on those roads, in most cases, was by walking. The only way you didn't walk in those days typically was if you had enough money to buy a wagon and a horse, naturally. You had like two-wheel wagons, you had your four-wheel wagons. In cities, more built-up areas, you'd have the fancier wagons that the gentry would ride in. Instead of walking places, they would ride in their wagons. But they were problematic, especially in bad weather, because these roads were dirt. They're not blacktop, they weren't concrete. If you're lucky, you may have some cobblestone in the cities, but they were dirt. So when it would rain, it would get muddy, very nasty, full of ruts. So it was kind of tough travel. But that's what they had, and they made do with what they had.